Good morning to all of you. It's an honor and a pleasure to participate in this conference today. It's a particular pleasure and honor because some of you may know this week in Jewish communities around the world, we begin anew our annual lectionary cycle. And so we read from the Torah the story of Genesis, beginning with Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And of course, included in this selection from Sefer Bereshit, the book of Genesis, is the first call, the first proclamation by God of the sanctity, the Kedusha of Shabbat. Given the nature of the question for this morning, I want to speak about this complicated issue of who owns time from a personal perspective first and foremost, because clearly it's a complicated issue and there are a cluster of different factors, economic, political, etc. But I want to speak about my own experience. I think I can be most effective and most helpful if I speak from my own location. And I would say that among the greatest challenges for me in my Shabbat observance is a kind of achievement anxiety. To be honest, simply to cease and desist, which is the root in Hebrew for the word Shabbat, is a very challenging thing to do. Because I've been raised in a series of circles of cultural milieu in which study and action and achievement are valued highly. And so to pause from that is personally quite challenging, even if it means putting down a copy of the Torah or of Martin Buber. You can hear the irony, I hope, in my voice as a rabbi and academic who studies religious texts and traditions. But at a certain point, that melacha, that work has to be put aside. I want to frame much of what I'm going to say in the next few minutes by referencing the great theologian and activist of the 20th century, Abraham Joshua Heschel. And I hope if you don't own a copy of his book, The Sabbath, you'll purchase one today or sometime soon. Heschel talks about two primary dimensions of human experience that intersect, one being the dimension of time and the other being of space. And his critical assessment of modern culture, both his experiences in Europe and then in the United States, he suggests quite strongly in this little but powerful book that there's a corrective that's necessary, because so much of our energies are spent in the realm of space, particularly trying to dominate space. And he says in a psycho-spiritual moment of reflection, which is deeply meaningful to me, and I think it relates directly to my opening statement about achievement anxiety, that there's a kind of existential dread that we all face, or not, but hovers in the midst of our consciousness. And that animates some of this over-engagement in the realm of space or thingness, because we believe that if we build firewalls, as he describes it, that somehow we can outpace our own mortality. And then he begins to speak specifically about the Sabbath, which I think is an ingenious move. Because if we can come to terms with the fact that our lives on earth are limited and our achievements will forever be limited. Think about Moses at the age of 120, still yearning, still longing to lead and to go further. But if we can try and come to some greater equanimity about our place in time and space, then we can begin to ask, I think, in a healthier, more holistic way, how do we want to spend that time? It's no accident that Heschel describes Shabbat as a quote-unquote palace in time. Notice the mixed metaphor of space and time. Shabbat then becomes a sacred context for, among other things, contemplation and discernment. How is it that we want to spend our time? To put it in more overtly religious terms, in a theistic context, what does God call us to do and to be with the limited time that we have? But you can't discern unless you have some space, unless you have some sacred space, as it were, in which to do that kind of thinking and reflecting. And doing it both alone, but in community, with friends and family, and doing it with some sense of celebration. That there's a freedom that comes from understanding both our limits and our possibilities. One of the reasons Heschel mixes those metaphors and is so inspired by this categorization of space and time is because Shabbat, for centuries, has been understood by rabbinic sages, who created much of the rulings around Shabbat based on a fascinating textual play. They look at the Torah and they see that there is a strong command to observe the Shabbat. But there are very few rules about how to do that, with the exception of a few descriptions of not collecting firewood and lighting fire. And so they turn to the most sacred form of work. That's the creation of the tabernacle. And they invert that category and say everything that you need to do to create a sacred space, the tabernacle or the temple, is exactly what you are not allowed to do on Shabbat. There are 39 categories that they outline in the Talmud and elsewhere of sacred work. And it's exactly those things that you might say that constitute the architecture of Shabbat by ceasing and desisting from them. Shabbat, you might say, then becomes a day for being more so than doing. But I want to point out something powerful that Heschel also mentions. Work is holy. Look at Genesis 2:15. While Adam and Eve are still in the garden, they are commanded to work and protect their environment. So work is sacred, though Shabbat is the first thing that is called holy. Not a time of some future orientation, not a person, not a place, but right from the beginning of time, Shabbat is the first thing that is described as kadosh. But work too, melacha, is holy. As I referenced the work of the Mishkan and the work of Adam and Eve in the garden. But Heschel makes a very important point which connects spiritual practice and social and environmental justice in my heart and mind, which is, once Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden, they are commanded again to work, but this time, it's not described as le'ovda u'leshomra, to work and protect, but it is described as be'itzavon, painful toil. Heschel calls on us and says, this is a point of discernment. There's a significant difference, a radical difference between work and protection as sacred activities and painful toil. And Shabbat can become a time for thinking through the ways in which we engage the other 6 days of life. How much of it is spent personally toiling as opposed to dignified and sacred work? And if you know anything about Heschel's life story, he couldn't end there, given all of the social causes he was involved with. So I would say this is where Shabbat becomes both an end and a beginning. We have to ask ourselves then, when we return to the world of doing, what about all of those other people that don't even have the time to think about sacred work and toil with a second or third or fourth job? And here we begin to think about structures of injustice. And how do we think about the fact that if we toil and toil and toil, and we subdue the earth under that kind of mentality, that it too cannot celebrate the Sabbath? And we know the relationship between the weekly Sabbath and the Shnat Shabbaton, the Sabbath that comes every 7 years, and the Jubilee. All of those are interconnected. It's a vision of holism. So the question then becomes, how do you honor, as we're instructed by our tradition every Friday and Saturday, to create Shabbat so that it's a remembrance both of Genesis, the act of creation, and of the Exodus? Because Shabbat is a statement about freedom, about liberation. There's a midrash, there's a rabbinic tale that suggests that Moses goes to Pharaoh while the Israelites are still enslaved and says, if you're not going to free us entirely, at least give us the dignity of Shabbat. Think about the contemporary resonance of that message. Genesis and Exodus. And I'll close simply by saying, how do we then think about the beauty and the celebration of Sabbath? And how we carry that spirit into the rest of our weeks? I like to refer to it as a Sabbath consciousness. How does it pervade everything else that we do in our lives? I want to leave you simply by saying that I asked folks to hand out this one-page double-sided sheet. And it's a reflection of an effort at Hebrew College in which we are trying to reach out specifically to Christian friends and colleagues and share in a humble way some of what we consider to be the beauties of our tradition. And this is one program through which we're trying to share key terms, key spiritual terms in our tradition. And I brought for you today a text about Shabbat that has some questions. You might want to take these up either now or later. So I'll just read the questions and then make space for my colleagues. The bottom of the page. Do you have any Sabbath traditions? How are they serving you? Are there any new practices you want to experiment with? And again, leading back to my final comment a moment ago, are there ideas or practices from Shabbat that you might weave into your everyday life? Thank you.